I find it very curious that some people say along in life that they made a lot of bad choices. For instance, I'm looking at the cover now of a magazine that came out recently, Life and Style, August 2022. And on the front cover is a picture of Winona Ryder, an actress who, it is said alongside her photo, the words, "I made a lot of bad choices," and then the words underneath it, "arrests, drugs, and heartbreak." Now, I find the word choice very problematic. For instance, an alternative point of view put out by Dr. David Schwartz in his book, The Magic of Thinking Big, an audiobook around 1960. A professor, therapist, PhD level down in Georgia at that time. His saying of key importance is that we apply the laws of nature or the laws of the universe to people just like anything else that we might call, I guess, inanimate. You might say an alternative point of view would be to criticize someone as being lazy, a bum, shiftless, shirking responsibility, and some other words come to mind too, such as a welfare cheat. And in these shows put out around 1910, or rather 2010, about some in Appalachia, Children of the Mountains, featuring Diane Sawyer, heading up some segments about 40 minutes in length total. It was said of people with trash in their front yards that there was some condemnation by certain circles, and they were expected to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. And yet the alternative point of view put out by a social worker or other person in the area was that there is a non-availability of resources to do this. I would say perhaps partly emotional resources, financial resources, what have you, as well as some addiction issues. But to say then that we can simply wave a magic wand and make it all disappear is, to me, magical thinking or wishful thinking. And likewise then concerning this term bad choices. For instance, on page 26 of this magazine, August 1st, 2022 edition, again, of the Life and Style magazine, talking about Winona Ryder, R-Y-D-E-R spelling. It says that in 2001, the 30-year-old Winona was arrested for shoplifting $5,500 worth of luxury items from Saks Fifth Avenue in Beverly Hills. She was convicted and sentenced to 3 years of probation and 480 hours of community service and had to pay $10,000 in restitution and fines and undergo counseling. But it also says later in the paragraph that she had received prescription painkillers from 20 different doctors over the previous 6 years and first began taking tranquilizers at 19. One of her doctors, who also counted Courtney Love as a patient, was stripped of his license by the California Medical Board on charges of over-medicating his patients. Now, some others who come out of prison, for instance, as they call it sometimes, are encouraged to, quote, take responsibility for their, quote, bad choices. Echoing what is said that Winona Ryder had said about her past there. But are we talking choices if you look in minute detail at the chain of events, which can go in the hundreds of incidents or components? Hence the phrase that there are a lot of moving parts to something. Even in an automobile, for instance, many, many moving parts to a transmission or an engine. And even many legal moving parts, if you will, as to regulatory laws constraining how the car is put together in the first place. So to simply say that your car chose not to start one morning seems rather fallacious an idea. In actuality, there's a very complex chain of events making the car not start, and it couldn't have been otherwise. Thus, in part, then, the concept of self-acceptance and how beautiful this can be to see. Self-acceptance of what you might call the complexities of life that make our lives to be none other than they are, could be. That things are exactly as they should be, you might say. I'll finish up by saying an alternative point of view held by some, sometimes with more power. I was watching a year ago a show, and the governor of a certain state was being castigated, blamed for not fixing COVID, amongst other things. And he might have said, well, how can I fix COVID? He might say, I don't have the resources to. Now, does anyone say, well, you made bad decisions, bad choices, and so that's why you didn't fix COVID? Are you irresponsible? Are you a bum, lazy, and therefore you didn't fix COVID? Do you have addictions that made you not apply yourself to fixing COVID, or hiring the best help, or saying things about people who are trying to fix it, who don't have the capacity to? There seems to me a double standard. People on the bottom end, coming out of prison, what have you, are told they made bad choices and were irresponsible and need to take responsibility. Or same toward those who didn't go to prison but are told they had addiction issues and the aftermath thereafter coming out in public. Yet when it comes to problems of society and these perpetuating infrastructure issues, crime issues, racial issues, education issues, what leader has ever been told or accused widespreadly of being, quote, irresponsible for making, quote, bad choices? When in fact, this goes on even in court too. The persons such as O.J. Simpson, arguably hiring the best lawyer in town or the country to lay out how things could not have played out any differently than they are. But those with lawyers with low brain power, so to speak, or emotional capacities might say, well, the person just made bad choices, please take that into account as extenuating circumstances, instead of being able to lay out a solid argument to advocate that things could not have been any other than that they were by a specific chain of events laid out in clear fashion for the jury and judge to examine. Thus why many people would like to have as much money as possible to hire the best lawyer possible if they ever get in a scrape, who can define that the person didn't make a bad choice, but in fact things turned out just as you would have expected, all things considered. I'll close then with a phrase I once heard that's quite illuminating here, that everybody in prison feels that they're innocent. If that is in fact often the case as believed or stated by, quote, prisoners or those coming out, maybe it's because they believe, arguably in my mind correctly, that things couldn't have turned out any way differently than they did. And thus, the whole concept of bad choices, irresponsibility, are words we really need to examine as possibly fallacious. Maybe we need to, as Chris Do said, D-O, in one of his talks on his YouTube channel, The Futur, F-U-T-U-R, maybe we need to, as he humorously said, deneuter certain words. Strip them of the belief we have in them kick them out of the dictionary, so to speak, and evolve them into a better conception of reality, including the claim that someone made bad decisions and therefore should be held accountable in a court of law, as well as being someone to be condemned morally.